63. Are you ready for this? Sophie transmitted as she stroked Silvany's shimmering nose. The Earth's shadow had just started its slow path across the moon, making a red-orange eclipse in the starry sky. The celestial festival would be well underway, which meant she and Silvany were almost to their cue. They were the finale. Ready, Silvany transmitted, but without her usual enthusiasm. Sophie had spent the last 3 days using every non-school related second preparing Silvany for the night's big move. All the gentle medical care had helped Silvany stop panicking around other elves and animals, and Sophie had spent hours explaining every detail about what would happen and why and what they needed to do. Silvany was as ready as she'd ever be. But now that the moment had come, Sophie wasn't ready to say goodbye. "Friend," Silvany said, nuzzling Sophie's neck and filling her mind with a lonely ache. "Come." "I can't," Sophie whispered. "You know I can't." "Stay," Silvany tried. "You can't do that either." Silvany hung her head, and Sophie felt her eyes get watery. She'd only spent 5 weeks with the strong-willed alicorn, most of which had been filled with more headaches and glittery poop than she would have liked. But Sophie couldn't imagine looking out in the pasture and not seeing her fluttering around, or sleeping without Silvany's warm calm filling her mind. Silvany didn't want to go either. "Friend, stay. Home." "It's not safe here anymore," Sophie told her. "Look what happened to your beautiful wing." She'd removed the bandage a few minutes before. The council didn't want the public to see it, and there was a dark scar among the feathers. Sophie stared at the star-shaped bruise on her own hand as she traced the thin red line on Silvany's skin. Another thing they had in common. Another reason this had to be done. The sanctuary was hidden inside the Himalayas. The dwarves had secretly hollowed out the enormous mountains centuries before, and the gnomes and elves had converted the space to a lush paradise with every possible climate, comfort, and care. Access was restricted and regulated, and the council had amped up security even more for Silvany's arrival to make sure that no one would be able to hurt her there. And Silvany would finally be able to meet the other alicorn, and hopefully with time they would breed, ensure the existence of their species. "I'll come visit," Sophie promised, which perked Silvany up enough to fill Sophie's head with "Visit, visit, visit," mixed with the occasional "Keef." "Yes, I'm sure Keef will come too." She reached up and ran her fingers through Silvany's icy mane, meeting her deep brown eyes. "But I'll miss you." "Miss," Silvany repeated, transmitting the ancient ache she'd sent Sophie before. "Friend." Tears slipped down Sophie's cheeks, and she wrapped her arms around Silvany's neck. "What matters is keeping you safe," she told her, repeating the words until Silvany finally accepted them. Sophie tried to accept them, too, as Silvany lowered her shimmering head and let Sophie climb on her back. "You don't have to do this, Sophie," Grady said, startling them both. Sophie turned around and found Grady and Adeline watching her. It was strange to see them in their long silver capes embroidered with the council's seal, but they were both officially part of the nobility again, assigned to assist with the search for the kidnappers and the Black Swan. Assuming Sophie pulled this off without a hitch. "I thought you guys were at the festival already," she said as she adjusted her heavy cape. The celestial festival was being held at the base of Mount Everest, so everyone had to wear thick clothes and clunky boots to stay warm. "We were," Adeline said, stepping close enough to inspect Silvany's wing. "I wanted to check Silvany's wound." She frowned at the dark red scar. "And I wanted to tell you one more time that you don't have to do this," Grady added. They'd both insisted on knowing what Sophie was planning, and she'd finally caved and told them everything. How Mr. Forkgold modeled her DNA on alicorns, how she figured out how to teleport, in theory at least, and how she was planning to test that theory for her spectacle. They'd been trying to talk her out of it ever since. Once she did this, the council would know she could teleport, and they didn't want Sophie to feel forced to expose her secrets, especially since they kept saying they were sure the council would only give Grady a minor punishment. Sophie gave them the same answer she'd given them every time. "I know I don't have to. I want to." Adeline gave Sophie a hug. Grady sighed. Letting you go never gets any easier, does it? Though it might help if you weren't always doing such dangerous things. Sophie smiled. It's going to be okay. And hey, we fixed everything else. We just need to solve this last thing. Grady nodded. I trust you. Me too, Adeline agreed. I suppose that means I should as well, Sandor grumbled, as he stepped from the shadows. But I still prefer when you stay by my side, Miss Foster. Sophie smiled. I know, and I promise I will try to be better about that. The kidnappers were still out there, and there were even more of them than she'd realized, so she was going to have to keep her burly bodyguard around for a while. But I have to do this first. Sandor reluctantly nodded. I'll be waiting for you when you arrive. Adeline wiped her eyes and took Grady's hand as he raised his pathfinder. I guess we'll see you soon, Adeline whispered. I'll be there in a minute. Sophie watched the three of them glitter away and tightened her grip on Silvany's neck. Silvany raised her glittery wings. No, we're not going to fly, remember? She was glad Silvany could move without any pain, but she had no idea if the wing could really support any weight, and she wasn't going to let Silvany hinder her recovery by trying to fly too soon. Silvany tensed as they trotted toward the edge of the cliffs, and Sophie was nervous too. But if the last few weeks had taught her anything, it was that sometimes there was no guarantee. Sometimes she just had to trust herself and believe that if she put her mind to it, she was strong enough to pull through. It always came down to trust. No flying, Sophie repeated the command until Silvany tucked her wings. Trust? Trust. Sophie closed her eyes, taking a deep breath and rallying her concentration before she transmitted. Run! Silvany whinnied and galloped forward, bounding across the last stretch of grass before she leapt off the edge of the cliff. Calm, Sophie transmitted as they fell down, down, down. And she filled Silvany's mind with warmth as she repeated, Don't you dare try to fly. Miraculously, Silvany obeyed, and Sophie forced her eyes open and focused on the dark rocks and shallow waves that were hurtling toward. They hadn't been able to practice this part. It was too dangerous to try more than once, but she knew she could do it. She embraced the fear and adrenaline pumping through her veins, gathered it all together until it was a giant ball of force, and shoved it out of her mind. A thunderous crack split the space in front of them, and they slipped into the void. Sophie concentrated on a mental image of the sanctuary, and as she did, her instincts told her how to weave through the gray mist. More thunder crashed as the space parted, and they raced through the split onto the icy ground at the base of the towering mountain, amid a shower of sparkle and hundreds of twisting beams of colored light. A flash of blue light painted across the sky, illuminating the thousands of wide-eyed spectators gaping at them in stunned silence as Silvany slowed to a stop. Good girl, Sophie told her as Silvany dipped her head in the bow that they'd rehearsed. The crowd went wild. Silvany whinnied, her silvery body quivering with excitement. Sophie tried to calm her, but Silvany was too caught up in the frenzy, and before Sophie could stop her, Silvany raised her shimmering wings and launched them into the sky. You can fly, Sophie screamed, even though they only made it a few feet off the ground before Silvany set them back down. Fly, the giddy alicorn transmitted as Sophie strangled her with a hug. Safe. Yes, Sophie told her, blinking back tears. You're safe. Several of the counselors, along with a fleet of goblins, rushed Silvany to the sanctuary as soon as Sophie dismounted. She barely managed to transmit, I'll see you soon, as Silvany trotted away. But before the alicorn disappeared through the gates, Silvany filled Sophie's mind with warmth and told her, Friend, visit. Sophie wiped her eyes and promised, I will. You weren't kidding about the spectacle, Counselor Tarek said, startling her as he approached her from behind. An elf who teleports? Definitely one for the history books. Great, Sophie mumbled. He laughed. You'll get used to your fame eventually, Sophie. Somehow she doubted that, but at least she wasn't hearing whispers about the girl who was taken from the crowd. Yet. In the meantime, Counselor Tarek said, dragging her out of her worries, I thought you would want to know that the counselors are more than satisfied with what you've done here tonight. We can already feel the unrest easing. She watched the families of elves laugh and smile as the lights danced in the sky. I hope it lasts, she whispered. Me too. The worry woven into his tone made Sophie wonder if he was thinking the same thing she was. The rebels would strike again. But Sophie planned to be ready this time. Counselor Tarek cleared his throat. Now that Alden's back, I know you probably won't need my help, but you still have your imparter. Hail me any time. Thanks. She hoped she wouldn't have to take him up on that, but with the way her life seemed to go, it was good to know she had at least one counselor on her side. There you are, Miss Foster, Bronte said, stepping from the shadows. He eyed Counselor Tarek as he said, Am I interrupting something? Yes, Sophie and I were having a pleasant conversation, so I'm sure this is your cue to ruin it. Bronte scowled and folded his arms. Actually, I do need to have a word with Miss Foster. Alone. Sophie sighed. Of course you did. Counselor Tarek gave her an apologetic smile as he left her with her pointy-eared nemesis. But Sophie held Bronte's icy glare, surprised at how easy it was to face him. You really can't feel that, he asked after a minute. Feel what? Apparently your mind is impenetrable to inflicting now. You tried to inflict on me? Oh, relax. It didn't work, did it? No, Sophie grumbled, wishing she could fling something at his head. Was that all you needed? He released an epic-length sigh. No. I also wondered, is it true that you can inflict positive emotions? I think so. Why? His eyes dropped to his hands. Well then, perhaps we'll have something to teach each other. His voice was barely a whisper, and Sophie wondered if she'd heard him right. Did Bronte just admit that he had something to learn from her? Anyway, he said, the edge returning to his features, I suggest you prepare for your next session. I will not be holding back. Sophie doubted he had the first time, but she'd already faced her deepest fears. How much worse could it be? She flashed her most confident smile, which felt more like a smirk, as she told him, Bring it on. Sophie sat alone on the cold ground in a shadowy corner of the valley, watching the beams of light twist and spin above the snow-capped mountains. She could definitely understand why the elves had turned Orem-Vackers flashing into such a celebration. It looked like fireworks and lasers and the aurora borealis had all been choreographed to dance around the eerie red moon. But she hadn't felt like joining the festivities. So I think I speak for everyone when I say, you can teleport? Sophie turned around, surprised to see Dex standing with Fitz, Keith, and Bianna, especially since he didn't even look annoyed about it. Oh, you figured that out, huh? She'd been hoping it would take them a few days. Keith told us. Yeah, I knew the moment you brought us home. Seriously, Foster, when are you going to realize that you can't lie to an empath? I think I'm finally figuring that out. Not that it matters. You guys know all my darkest secrets now anyway, don't you? If you mean you're secretly in love with me, Keith said, plopping down beside her, then yeah, everyone is well aware. And if you mean the stuff about your DNA, well, we heard Grady explain that to Alden. Oh. She didn't have much more to say than that, except, well, now you know how weird I am. I've always known that, Dex said, sitting on her other side. But remember, I like weird. Me too, Bianna chimed in. Me three, Fitz added, smiling so wide when she met his eyes that her heart fluttered. We could all use a little more weird in our lives. Sophie wasn't so sure she agreed, with how crazy everything had been, and all the things she still had to figure out. She wouldn't have minded if life got a little more normal for a while. But maybe weird was okay, too. Especially if her friends were willing to accept it. Whoa, are you crying? Keith asked. And she blushed as she tried to smear away her tears. You're supposed to cry when bad things happen, Foster, not good things. I know, I'm sorry. I don't know what's wrong with me. I do, Keith said, taking her hand as Dex grabbed the other, and Fitz and Bianna each squeezed her shoulders. Absolutely nothing. Sophie smiled as she glanced up at the flickering lights in the sky, feeling nothing but calm and happiness as they flashed in her eyes. I hate to say this, Keith, but I think you might be right. And that's the end of Book 2.